And today we are hearing more on the case of the Missouri teen shot dead by a police officer in August, prompting weeks of unrest, as you may remember. A new New York Times report gives details that have not been heard before, including evidence inside the officer's car and his version of events, according to the New York Times. So we want to bring in our legal team: Richard Herman, criminal defense attorney; Avery Friedman, law professor, civil rights. We're short on time. Let's get right to this. We're hearing very strong evidence now that there were bullet holes inside of the car, that there was blood on the officer, meaning direct contact. Richard, how do you think this new evidence is going to affect this case?
Deb, first of all, there's no evidence yet in this case, because the only evidence is what's going to be presented in court and subject to testing by cross-examination. But we are hearing multiple different versions, and we're hearing versions that tend to corroborate some of the stories that are coming out of the police department. If that's the case, that as a criminal defense attorney, when you hear multiple different stories and multiple different accounts, what does that do? That makes you pause for a moment to reflect. You're not sure. That's reasonable doubt. The more multiple stories that come in, the better chance of an acquittal here, just like Trayvon Martin in the Zimmerman case.
And that's the interesting thing, because even no matter how many eyewitness accounts you hear, all of it is from a very distinct, limited perspective, what they saw at an exact moment. The grand jury has to piece all that together. Wilson, if you read the New York Times, he was trying to leave his car when Brown shoved him back in, pinned him inside. He says that Brown tried to grab for his gun. That made him fear for his safety. You know, Avery, do you believe that there could potentially not be an indictment once the grand jury looks at all of this?
Well, the interesting thing about the Times article, the front page article, was that we're really dealing with two forums. Number one, we're dealing with a state grand jury consideration, which has been going on for 2 months. That's a possibility. The other issue that the article made clear, whether or not it's corroborated, there are unnamed officials, not identified in the article, that talk about whether or not there's going to be a civil rights claim coming out of Washington. So we have two different forums, two different kind of cases. Whether or not there's a potential conviction really is sort of down the road. The question is there probable cause? That's what is going to be considered in both forums. So right. This detonates some very, very explosive information that's generating a lot of emotion right now.
Richard, what are your thoughts on that?
My thoughts are this. The officer went to the grand jury and testified. That rarely happens when you're a target and a proposed criminal defendant in a case. He testified for 4 hours in front of that grand jury. Now, the burden of proof at trial, beyond a reasonable doubt, is a much higher standard than what's required in a grand jury to indict. But if there are so many conflicting versions coming in this grand jury, the grand jurors will be confused, and you may not get a true bill out of them.
Yeah, and I spoke to a lot of lawyers down there.
That's different.
Yeah,
that's different, Deborah.
Go ahead, Avery, go ahead.
That's different than the civil rights considerations.
That'll never happen. Which is
exactly why the civil rights, they're in there now looking at all of this as well. And look, a lot of people not convinced that that there is going to be some sort of an indictment. Richard Herman, Avery Friedman, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Be well, Deb.
And this